Okay, so there we go. Yeah, guys, thank you for be here and be awesome to join us in today's meeting to speak about, to learn about how Daniel is going to teach us about introduction in information architecture. So I think it's really important for new ones that is jumping to user experience. And I hope you can get some notes, and it's going to be recorded, and also then we can go for YouTube channel. We have our YouTube channel to download these these recordings. So then and I want to know if someone has any question for me about for design challenge. Maybe later you can ask me, or for me or Adam, whatever is okay, whoever is okay. So Daniel, I wanted to give you yeah, I wanted to give you, you can share your screen when you want to start.
Sure, yeah, I'll just start off by saying, thank you guys for inviting me and for letting me join the group as well. I really appreciate it. I'll start and preface by saying, before I get into the talk and the lecture here a little bit. So yeah, my name is Daniel Szilagyi. I'm a UX UI designer based in Vancouver, Canada. I've been working professionally for around 8 to 9 years in the industry. I initially started working in games and mobile and console UX and UI, and kind of moved my way up into more software-related companies. I worked for startups over the course of my career, small startups, medium-sized businesses, and then larger corporations across Canada. So I have a pretty well-rounded experience working in different fields and getting a pretty good level of understanding. So yeah, the talk I'm going to give today is basically, it's aimed pretty introductory. As mentioned, I wasn't sure exactly what the experience level of people was in this group. And I know some people are really experienced and been working for a number of years, and some people are transitioning into this area. So I didn't want to, make it obviously too technical. So yeah, I'll keep it pretty light, and then it shouldn't take too long. And then hopefully at the end, if there's questions or comments or just general feedback, it'd be great to go over that with anyone who has anything to share or has anything to ask. But yeah, let me go right ahead and share my screen here. Okay. So I'm going to do this here. And just, I assume everyone here can see everything that I have on my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, awesome. So yeah, just a quick introduction to IA. So as mentioned, it's just information architecture. So this is just like, again, just my opinion on it. I'm definitely not like the master expert at this. I think everyone still learns in the industry as you go over it with time. So, I always just say it's best to learn from a variety of sources and keep your mind open with things. But generally, I think, I'll cover a pretty wide gamut of what it is. So things like this. So basically what I want to go over today is kind of this high-level stuff. So basic introduction to IA, a little bit of the history of IA and what information architecture actually is, the use of IA in products and industry, and then combination examples. And then at the end, like I mentioned, I'll open it up to Q&A, which is general discussion as well. So people can get out their thoughts and questions, and we can cover it. And we'll go from there. Yeah, so I'll start right off. So what is IA? So information architecture. I'm not going to read everything here verbatim. I'll just give you a quick summary of it. But basically, it's a tricky field. It's interwoven into UX and UI design. It's depending on which industry you've worked in, what your company is like, or where you're going to be working. It is interpreted a little bit differently. So there's no cookie cutter mold. At least in my experience, I've never come across it where it's always universally the same, depending on the size of the companies. Sometimes this role is a specialist role. Sometimes it is a role that is accompanied with being a UX or product designer. And other times it's kind of a combination of UX research and information architecture as well. it really depends on the company structure and the product structure. So, take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, information architecture in itself as a job title is a little bit more infrequent. You don't generally see someone just doing it as a job. It is definitely part of a job position and category, but it is not often the only thing that you would be doing. However, it is super valuable and it's incredibly important, and it does lend itself across multiple roles. With those of you familiar with UX as a whole, generally, it's kind of the same thing. You are really dipping into multiple areas of a company, right? You're not just dealing with design, you're dealing with sales, you're dealing with marketing, you're dealing with product, and this applies very much the same way. And really, the point of it at the end of the day is to help people understand their surroundings and find what they're looking for. It's a better way of structuring information, essentially. Yeah, so the objectives in this case is hopefully understanding information architecture, a little bit of user research and analysis, understanding navigation and hierarchy. This is elements on the page and UI on the page, wireframing and figuring out how you get things like user flows and mind maps and all that kind of stuff, taxonomies and metadata, which is a little bit more technical, and then some references, which I'll throw in at the end of this slide as well. And if anyone's interested and wants a copy of this, I'm more than happy to send it out. So yeah, IA information architecture is basically the structure, creation of website or application or other projects, which allows people who are the users to have a better idea of the information that relates to their position. So it's basically the creation of it gives you the results of sitemaps, hierarchies, you get your categorizations, navigation, and metadata and stuff like that. So traditionally, you would start, dividing this up, content, and you put into categories. Basically, here the main trains of thought or the main high-level questions. And again, for people in UX, this is a little bit more common, but you always ask the question why, how, where, what, when. Those are all really important, and I think they all translate really well into information architecture. Basically, what is the flow of the users through the site or the product itself? What do you expect them to do? How do you expect them to transverse it? This gets into things like user personas and user stories and all that. How does the application actually help the user catalog their information, or where is it stored? How is the information presented back to the user? So this is more front-end facing. And then is the information actually helping the customer or the person, the user, and actually helping them drive decisions, or is it just superficial and just kind of lets them see something? So the one point I touched on a little bit earlier is user research and analysis, and this is true of any project really. With my own experience as well, you always want to dive into research and analysis first, just generally good rule of thumb. A little bit of the history as well, going back. Information architecture kind of started around the 1970s, way before the sort of the modern web and web that we know of. It has numerous its sort of roots go back to different fields, more like library science, and it goes into like cognitive psychology and architecture. And again, this kind of draws from that. It's just a way to categorize information, a way for that to make sense. So it kind of trickles down from that. And as those of you know who are in UX more entrenched, there are heavy elements of psychology and other elements that go into it. It's not just purely a design thing. So the more you explore and learn and have a better understanding, it really helps you there. I mentioned user personas. That's another huge part. So user personas, for those who don't know, are just a general, this is who you anticipate your user to be through your product and your, basically your service. I don't want to get too much into this. I believe there was another talk you guys had previously, so I don't want to trend backwards on anything, but basically it's just a hypothetical narrative of various website users, people who are going to load, go in, see what's on your website or your product, and basically you're trying to figure out how they might access this, right? So this is basically putting yourself in someone else's shoes, figuring out how they might perceive and use your product or your services. So this is kind of just the basis of that. So here's a really rough example of, for example, like a library might do, right, for their information architecture. As I mentioned before, information architecture doesn't just apply to UX. It is sort of a thing in the world generally. You'll see engineers and scientists and all sorts of other fields use this, and it basically is the same thing. You're trying to categorize and have a hierarchy of information and services. So, for example, a library might do something like this. Obviously, depending on how they want to surface things or what the subcategories are, they could go even further. This example here is actually one that I'm currently working on at the company I work at right now. So I work at Cycle. We are a software management company. Our platform is geared mostly exclusively towards audiology, which is the study of hearing. And right now we're going through a section of, we're trying to polish it up a little bit and fix some things that we've had in the past with our platform. So we're kind of looking at the IA, and this is an example of doing something like that, where all the green elements, all the green boxes you see here are basically the top level elements. Everything in gray, like the darker gray, might be a secondary level, and then everything in the white might be just page level, so something that you see immediately when you go to this section. So, this is an experiment that we had gone through with the UX team at Cycle, myself included, but this involved discussions with product, this involved discussions with engineering, this involved discussions with sales and marketing as well, to really understand how users are coming in, using the platform, how things are structured, why are they structured this way, and then the intricacies of how one thing relates to another. So you can see how quickly it can get really, really, really complicated, because one thing leads to another, and you have to kind of be able to account for that and have a logic to it, and really understand why it's doing it this way versus another way as well. Other examples, something really simple like this, you could just have a home page. It just divides out into different sections. These sections could have subsections, tertiary, and you can go all the way down to like level 3, 4, 5, depending on how detailed you want to get. If you guys notice, and you go into more enterprise level platforms like Oracle, or you get into things like SAP, or any of those, they get into like 4 or 5 levels deep or further sometimes. So it really just depends on what you're doing. So as a summary, information architecture is generally, it's a collective part of the UX project. So like I said, it's something that I'm doing currently right now in my own role. And the common tasks include research. So looking at other platforms, how they, structuring this, what are they doing? Why are they doing it? Things like navigation creation. So basically, kind of like what I showed you before, where what is high level elements, what is in, say, a left-hand field or left-hand column. Why would you be doing this? The idea of navigation itself can be further broken down, and you can really think around, is it responsive? Are you thinking from a mobile first approach? Are you thinking from desktop? All that kind of stuff comes into play. That point gets you into wireframing, so then you start to do more screens, and you start to figure out some of the flows and where things live. This could be anywhere from really low fidelity mock-ups. So you could do something like Envision's freehand, where you're just basically drawing, or you can do something a little bit more mid-level if you feel comfortable. Really depends. And then, you can do, if you have the data and you have that information, you can do some data modeling, and you can see where people are actually going previously, or where people have gone. And you take away from all of this, and you start to craft this a really solid navigational element. So information architecture can take on a lot of responsibilities as well. You have to learn about the audience. Who is your audience? For us at Cycle, our key demographic is usually a little bit of an older demographic. They're usually not as tech savvy. So we're not aiming for like a Facebook, TikTok kind of group. We're aiming for somebody who's a little bit older, maybe not super tech savvy, but somebody who needs to access a lot of information quickly and easily. So our UI and our UX and our information architecture is going to differ greatly from another product as well. We also need to do things like usability tests, right? So maybe A/B testing, usability testing. Does this make sense? Do people understand? Card sorting, depending on how much time you have. Stakeholder interviews. So like I said, we've brought in multiple different departments into this conversation of information architecture from my own personal experience of working in it. You generally want to have those if you can. User interviews, if it's possible. Sometimes it's not. Some of these times you can't always talk to customers. You can't always get that information up front. Makes your job a little bit harder, but you do the best you can. In our case, for example, as well, we don't always have the ability to do this. So the way we get around it is we literally ask other people within the company that might not be as familiar with some of the product. So we go to our sales teams, we go to our customer experience teams, we go to some people in product team and ask them to test this and get some of their feedback as well, and then incorporate that into it. And then we do user testing later on, and then we refine from there. But this is just, again, it's really varied. It really depends where you're working, what you're doing, what your experience is, and all that. It's gonna differ a little bit, but generally this is good rule of thumb. And yeah, the more research you do, the better understanding you'll gain of how people use your product and your services, and how you can craft that experience to tailor fit their needs a little bit better. And then, yeah, which mental models these people have within their own use of the application. With content modeling, you might have in your company a position called a content strategist. Again, that might also be rolled into a ball with UX. It might be a separate thing. The UX terminology and that sort of like roles of the job has differed greatly over the last 10 years. Some companies still don't understand what UX actually means, and some people think it's everything. Some people think it's this. Some people specialize. Generally, in my experience, larger companies, your enterprise level companies will have enough of a budget to actually allocate people for different roles. So you might be working with somebody who's a strategist, but also a researcher, but then you'd have a UX designer, a UI person as well, and even more depending on how particular they want to be. But yeah, you can definitely structure your information and work in tandem with all these different people to really get the user needs, the business logic. I think business logic and requirements are very understated for a lot of the times of people getting into this. They really don't seem to care around what the actual end outcome of this is. It's not just yes, I want to make the experience better for the user and make sure they understand, but I also need to keep in mind what is the actual business for this. Like, how are people doing things? I sometimes business kind of goes on top first, and it kind of pushes out some UX a little bit sometimes. So it's your job as a UX designer to kind of push back and say, yes, business is important. Yes, we want to keep that in mind, but we also don't want to rule it out completely either. It's not a one-way street. So there's a lot of, depending on how the company's structured and how mature they are in their UX phase, that is either easier or more difficult depending. For website redesigns, sometimes you need to map things to already existing content. So very similar to what we're doing right now in my own situation. We have an existing platform that's been live for well over a decade. So people's muscle memory and mental models are already accustomed to a certain way of doing it. So any sort of change also needs to be met with a lot of data to prove that it is a change for better sake rather than change for change sake. So that's also things you can do with spreadsheets, mapping things out, requirements, and so on. There's some references here. I won't really click on any of these, but I think it's great for people to check out. And like I said, if anyone's interested and wants access to the slide, I'm happy to show that after this chat. But basically, yeah, this is just some of the references you can go to. There's a ton of them online as well. More than this, there's a couple books that I've listed here, just so that if people are interested in and want more something tangible to hold on to, something that they can also do. But yeah, that's a couple things there, and that pretty much leads me to kind of ending off sort of my lecture in terms of notes and stuff. I did want to open it up, I guess, to you guys or anyone in the audience watching today if you had any questions for me specifically, or sorry, I guess there's some here in the chat I can go through, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, just feel free to shoot them out. Okay, actually, so we have some here already. Do you want me to tackle these first? Do you guys have a preference? It's up to you.
Yeah, I mean, tackle those first, and then we can have some more, have people ask in person, like vocally.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll tackle them from the top down. Ildiko here says, how do you know the IAA is not right? This is usually just done through user testing and user research as well. Sometimes it's A/B testing, sometimes it's stakeholder meetings. You can try it out. Again, as a designer, we're a little bit biased sometimes. We think that our version is the right one. There's a lot of times when I've been really keen on one design and thought that that's the best way to do it and presented it. But when we ran through the test and we looked at the data, we realized that it was not the best. And then we would go back and have our option B or option C or whatever it was and determine that is the correct sort of thing here. Padma asks, what's the difference between information architecture and a sitemap? So information architecture also includes more of the details as well. So sitemap will just be generally like a little bit more high level, whereas information architecture, you get really into the weeds of where things live and how you transverse into them. You start to see more interaction design as well on top of it. So you can actually do that. Again, this depends. I've seen some people do pretty detailed sitemaps, but I've also seen some people do really laxed information architecture mock-ups as well. It really depends on the project and who's driving it and how much they want to get into it. But I would say for me, that's been the difference that I found, is that I generally gear my IA a lot more strongly in figuring out how things like breadcrumbs work, how do UI elements on the page work, as well as the overall navigation, whereas that is not something you would see in a sitemap necessarily. You would just see where you would see what is in the page or what is in those sections, but not necessarily where content is placed or how you move around it. Yeah, other people obviously has answered as well. So yeah, there's that too. But Mira asks, do you ever encounter clients that want to skip reviewing IA tests, all that stuff, because they don't see value? Yeah, all the time. Honestly, some of the companies I work for, especially smaller, less UX matured companies, there's a lot of times where they don't care. They just want quick and dirty. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying around a lot of the times they don't really understand what it is. They don't know what UX is. They just think that you're like a graphic designer still, and that you're just making pretty pictures and you're making things a little bit better. You'd be surprised that even at a high level corporation still, when I used to work at ADP, for example, a lot of the C-suite executives there still did not really understand what we were doing. They thought that we were just making, color changes and some icons and stuff, not realizing that we were actually dissecting their legacy application, investigating research into how we can do things more efficiently with less clicks, less taps, less, interactions, and making a more cohesive experience. And we had to actually show them that. We actually showed them a side-by-side to convince them that this is why we were doing it. And once they saw that, they saw the value of what we were doing and kind of started to understand the power of UX and the power of design thinking more forward. Kira asks, what would you look for in a job title description to know that IA is involved in? Is it a big part of the job? I haven't seen, in my experience, anyone specifically write in IA as their job title. Like I said, I've seen a lot of things like product designer, UX designer, UX UI designer, UX engineer, sometimes I've heard. It depends on the company. Some companies like to be more technical, so they refer to them as like engineers. Like I think, maybe I'm miscorrect, but I think Amazon kind of does it that way in some cases. Some of them just call them product designers, even though they're technically UX, or combination of both. But for, basically how much IA is involved, it depends on the product and depends where you're going. Some of those big companies are really, cemented already, and you don't necessarily need to retweak it. I would say IA is a big component when you're looking to remake something. So the previous job I worked, I was at a startup, and we did a version 1 of the platform. We launched it live. We got some user feedback. And then as part of version 2, we decided to enhance the entire IA of it. So we went through and refixed it. We shifted from a center-based tab navigation to a left-handed navigation with proper breadcrumbs and secondary level navigations and stuff like that, because we wanted it to scale. So that was another part of it as well, is, a lot of these things, it depends on, does the product need to scale? Does it need to be accessible on a different screen resolution? Is it desktop, mobile, or a combination of both? I think that will also determine if these things are critical or not. But in my experience, a lot of companies are still kind of getting to mobile. They're still not, especially a lot of the legacy large companies are still kind of lagging behind really taking a mobile first initiative, or they still think of them as just a watered down version of their main application, whereas they could really take that and actually make it a much more powerful standout application if they wanted to. It just depends. So Szilagyi said, as a freelancer, how do you offer UX design process to your clients? Do you have to teach them? Yeah, definitely have to teach them depending on the client. I don't try to get too heavy-handed with it because I don't want to seem like I'm preaching or that I'm trying to be some like know-it-all. I usually ask them what they want, like what is the end goal they're hoping for, and I try to figure out what their pain points are rather than trying to tell them what I think they should do. I try to actually ask, what is it that they're trying to need? Because a lot of the time the problem isn't so much that they want something, it's they're not trying to tell you that they want the thing that they need. Sometimes they'll say, oh, I want this or that, but they don't really know what that means. They don't understand how to explain that to you. They don't know the terminologies. So sometimes it's a little bit of back and forth with trying to figure out what the real problem is. And in that process, you actually learn more around what you can do to help them in other areas too, not just maybe that one thing that they thought they needed. It turns out it's a completely different thing all along. And for tools, I mean, I'm kind of a firm believer that a tool is just a tool. It's a pencil like anything else, so I'm not too attached to anything. That being said, I've mostly used Lucidchart to do my IAs, as you saw in my slide example. That's Lucidchart. It's a tool you can use. It's pretty easy to make little boxes and stuff and just kind of do that. I've used things like Google's Jamboard to do them. I've used things like InVision's Freehand. I used to use like Balsamic and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't really matter. It's just whatever works for you. I've even used things like Whimsical.
Omnigraphal?
Yeah, Omnigraphal is an old one from way back. I use that a little bit too. It depends. It's like every couple of years, it seems like there's some new cool hot tool somebody wants to use and they use it. But honestly, it's whatever works. As long as you can share it and show it to somebody, that's really important, I think. Yeah, Miro. Yeah, so Miro is the one I actually just started hearing about recently. I didn't even know that's a thing. I know there's other tools, like I use Sketch mostly at work, Sketch and Zeppelin. Those are my go-tos. I know people there's either big division into things like Experience Designer or Figma or all that kind of stuff. It just depends. I played with Figma. I like it. Experience Designer, I haven't tried yet as much, but I'm curious about it. Looks like it's really good. So yeah, I think it's really just up to you to make the best of whatever tool you have. Honestly, paper and pencil works too. If you just want to take a photo and send it to a client, if they're not in the room with you, or it's a remote kind of a thing, that works too. As long as you can iterate your ideas and you can really tell them your thought process, I think that works. So.
I have something I wanted to ask about. How have you ever dealt with working on information architecture where you needed to communicate or map different permission levels?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Yeah, I definitely had to do that in the last 2 times I've done IAA overhauls because the products I'm working on are more enterprise level as well. So we have different admin user type permissions that are coming into it and stuff like that. The first time I did it, we thought of it literally as a different like login with basically switches on the back end that we could toggle and say, this user type has access to these things, switches on, or if logged in as this other user type, switches off, so they don't see everything as well. Really, the biggest thing is just like, I guess, just showing data to users when they're in an enterprise level. So some of the clients that I've worked with in the past were large multinational like conglomerates that were across North America and Europe and Asia, and they had thousands and thousands of employees and things or locations, and they needed to get access to some of that. So it was really tricky to figure out a nice way for them to be able to see some of that stuff. So it was thinking around ideas of how to do navigation. If it's a tree structure, is it a secondary nav or like a tertiary nav structure? Is it like advanced search? There's all these different considerations that went into figuring out what would work best. And unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to user test it ahead of time, which is a shame. But like I said, you don't always get that privilege. So we had to make do with how we thought was going to work best. Basically taking that Facebook mantra of, release quickly, break fast, fix often kind of thing. And that's basically what we did. The second time, the one I'm doing right now, we do have some enterprise level clients, not nearly as much as the first one that I worked with. So our approach to it has been kind of similar, where we're thinking around, what do they see in terms of things like reports, for example, or employees. If there's hundreds and hundreds of them in a single location, how do they sift through these things? What can they see? What can they not see? Do we want to limit how much they see at once? And that's all discussions with other teams. That's me talking to the back-end team, front-end team, product team, stakeholder in this, which our stakeholder in my current example is also the CTO, who's acting as product and engineering. So it's a bit of a unique role for him. But yeah, so all over the place, we have different considerations going in. So a lot of conversations, a lot of testing, and trying things out.
I have another one. When working with an existing product that has already launched, or could have been around 3 years, 4 years of iterative launches of a SaaS product, how do you go about? Have you ever dealt with where you had to audit an existing application, understand how the data is structured from a back-end developer, and how that data is delivered to the front end, and then had to improve the user experience without changing too much of that architecture? And
Yeah.
And how did you facilitate those conversations and those planning phases and communicating with those different teams?
Yeah, for sure. Another really great question. I did have that experience. When I worked for ADP. For those who don't know, ADP is a payroll and HR company. So they basically deal with like an HCM. They deal with hiring. You can manage your staff. You can do payrolls, tax forms, all that kind of stuff. A lot of the large companies pretty much use them. Most people, they get a paycheck, probably get paid through ADP or Ceridian. Those are the two big ones. But yeah, when I was working at ADP, they're a legacy company, right? They've been around for a really long time. Their products have been in the market for 15 years plus, built on really ancient old back-end tech. For example, ADP was still using Cobalt when I was there, like 5 years ago or 4 or 5 years ago. So I don't think it's changed too much since then. But we had to actually deal with this exact problem where we basically had pre-existing platform, pre-existing stuff, legacy application, thousands of users using it. How do we go about changing it without upsetting everyone and making it worse for them? So the one thing is we basically it's an old programming language. We basically had to break down each, I guess, module you would call it, or each section, really figure out how it works, how it interconnects. This involved multiple stakeholder meetings with, engineering teams, basically front end, back end, again, product manager, product owner, and basically trying to figure out how it could work and how we could reduce. Our big focus was just trying to reduce clicks and surfacing more useful information. They had a nasty habit of hiding things 3 or 4 levels deep. So you'd click into something and then you wouldn't really see that information until maybe your 4th or 5th click in. So our main goal was to kind of surface a lot of that high level stuff. A lot of that involved just early level conversation with some of our mid-level clients who we're able to talk to and ask questions around, what's their typical workflow look like, really understanding what they're doing with it, getting that user persona really nailed down, and then really understanding and saying, okay, now we understand how people are using it. Here's what it is. Here's what we're proposing. And we kind of did a little bit of an A/B test. We launched one version for a little while and saw how people used it. And then we launched another and tried to gather some feedback from a small little closed off group that was not the whole. And once we got enough significant data to kind of back our claims, we ended up launching it slowly. The benefit for us was that because these were modules that were not necessarily one gigantic platform that integrated with each other, some customers only had that one module. So if we updated it, they got the update. Other people who don't, pay for it, don't have access to it, would never even see it or know that it even existed or had a change at all. So we were shielded from some of that. In other cases, it's been tricky because, we've had to kind of stay within realm. So where I am currently now in Cycle, when I first joined the company, our product has again been a legacy product, been in the market for more than 10 years. I came in with a fresh mindset of thinking like, oh, I want to change all this stuff because the UX looks terrible and the UI was, it was just okay. And I was met with consistent pushback of, we can't change this, we can't do this, it's done this way. And so basically we couldn't really fix a lot of those problems from a UX perspective. We had to band-aid a lot of it the best we could. And we made huge strides in that by surfacing information more clearly, having better navigation, things like anchors, things like tabbing, things like, making sure that we have clear calls to action, things that are links or things like that were clearly defined, setting up a proper structure and style system. It's really surprising how many companies don't have proper style branding guides overall for what things are and how things look. Of course, for the large enterprise companies, they're fine, but for the, I say, medium-sized and smaller startups, they historically have lacked in this and usually do not have a very structured system for telling you how things are working or looking, and a lot of designers kind of come up with things on the fly and it's not recorded properly. So it really comes down to also like company culture. How's the company handling things like notes, and how are things documented, and where are those things documented, and are they maintained properly? Do people have access to them? What systems do they use? And this is going to vary greatly depending on where you work and the company and the culture around it. But I've come across all aspects of that, where some of it's really amazing and very well shared out, and other areas where it's virtually non-existent and you're doing it on the fly, doing it yourself, being maybe the only designer or one of two designers, and you have to manage a small team and kind of keep that going. So
Okay.
Does anybody else have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, everybody. It's my first meeting with you all, so glad to be here.
Welcome.
Thank you. So I was thinking about progressive disclosure, and not so much from the standpoint of like screen by screen through like the form fields of a user flow, but more like the amount of content available, let's say, to a new user versus a user who has progressed enough that more information and content is unlocked for them. I'm wondering from an information architecture standpoint, like how you navigate that.
I think that goes back to user research and basically your user personas and knowing your customers and knowing who they are. Obviously there's that mindset of like, well, for existing customers, I don't want to be pestered with the same amount of stuff. Generally, I haven't had that specific instance, but I have had instances where we've broken it up and said, not even for forms, of just like information. I have done things for like more complicated sections like tax forms, for example, and particularly for US tax forms, where each state has a different type of tax form depending on where you are. And some of them have more information and more sections, some have less, some are more specific. So one of the projects I did for ADP was actually fixing that whole tax form area. And it was like a case of, well, presenting a big form with all these different input fields is a huge daunting task to a lot of users. So it's a lot of information architecture around figuring out what sections make sense contextually, and for that user's mental model of coming in, what makes sense to them, what can I kind of do bite-sized pieces of, and then do smaller pieces like that versus huge chunks or huge pages. That goes back to technical things as well, asking back end, front end. There's been changes in technologies now. You have things like Facebook, where they deal with every input as its own form, basically. And you have things like GitHub and other areas where they kind of deal with that more around like one thing can trickle to the next as you save. So you get different validations and different things that pop back. Those are still things like I'm not a super technical person. I'm not a full stack developer. I'm not really a programmer, but those are things I refer to the engineering team quite heavily on. And I will ask an engineer, if this happens, what do you think? What's best? And I'll try to get an answer from them first that will help influence my designs and decisions around what I can do. So I'd say data is a big thing. It definitely helps drive the conversation around like what is feasible and yeah, and what can kind of help from that as well. So,
Well, thank you.
Anyone has other question for Daniel? You can see.
Yeah. Also, just, we still have some bit of time on the clock as well. I also worked in the games industry for a little while, games and then television animation prior to getting to games. So if anyone's curious about that, just off topic, I'm always happy to, chat about that. If you guys are interested and you want to keep in touch or you have any other questions, feel free to look me up on LinkedIn. That's pretty much one of the best places to reach me and ask questions. I am a part of the Discord group, but I'm kind of busy throughout the day. So to be honest, I don't really check in all that often. So LinkedIn's a little bit better because I can kind of just streamline people if they have questions. And some of the people here on the call have already added me. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that as well. And then, yeah, I also have a podcast that I've been starting up that I'm going to be getting more into around topics like that we talked here today around things like job seeking and interview skills and my experiences in UX and games for myself here in Vancouver in Canada and stuff like that. So if you get a chance, you can look it up. It's called Not Your Grandpa's Podcast. I only have one episode up at the moment, but I plan to do a little bit more. And yeah, I will write it out as well. But like I said, if you guys have any questions or want to, be in touch, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. It's probably one of the best ways to get a hold of me.
Thank you.
Hey, Daniel.
So much.
I did have a question. I missed the first 10 minutes, so sorry if you already answered this question, but can you tell us a little bit more about how you got inspired to be a UX designer? Did you switch from a different career and start this afterwards, or did you find it early on and kept with it?
That's a good question. I didn't actually get into that, but I'm glad that you asked. So I actually started my career in television animation because I'm a huge animation cartoon nerd, and that's what I wanted to do. And I went to school for that. I learned how to become a traditional animator, and I can draw and illustrate really well. And I got into that field, and I worked in a different bunch of roles in different studios here in Vancouver, doing things like character design and color and storyboarding and layout and all these different roles for different cartoon shows. And then a couple years after, while I was already in it, I kind of realized, well, it's a really fickle industry. I mean, if anyone has worked in movies or anyone knows anyone working in movies, they can attest to it pretty well. But it's a really fickle environment. It's very cyclical. It's very much around contracts and negotiations. It's really stressful because you never know where your next job might be or if it's coming up. You're at the mercy of networks and studios and contracts. So it was really stressful, and it was, I started to realize that maybe not a good, like a long-term life goal for me, even though I really love it still, maybe not something I wanted to do. And I kind of got my start in UX and in UI because I could actually, illustrate and draw really well. So when I started to work, one of the first jobs I had was working in a small startup for a game studio, and they were doing a 2D educational learning app for kids with health issues, particularly diabetes. So I started to get my foot in the door by first applying as sort of like their digital artist. I got in the door, started doing these designs, characters, and backgrounds for them. And I got in the art department. I worked alongside the director, a UX and UI designer, and a manager, and basically got kind of charmed into it by the other designer there. And I got really involved. He kind of taught me a little bit more. I already had a pretty good natural grasp for graphic design and layouts and stuff. I kind of always liked doing that back in school. And so the two kind of blended together, and I kind of kept at it. He kind of mentored me there for a little while. I learned quite a bit from him. And it kind of kept snowballing from there. The next job I got, I distinctly, went in as more of a UI role and started to learn a little bit more about UI and games and, 9 slicing systems and repeats and what's more efficient. This was way back in like the early 2010s. So it was still around that time where the iPhone and Android were just coming up, and it was still kind of a new thing. So everyone was trying to figure things out, and there was no formal like UX schools. Like UX school wasn't a concept back then, I don't think, as much. So I kind of learned on the job. I learned each job I went to, I learned more around UI and how that company did it, what was more efficient, faster, better, what tools and systems did they use. I started to get much more interested in solving problems rather than creating pretty pictures. So I got much more into the UX. And as I grew and got more responsibility in one of my roles, I was an art lead where I oversaw teams of artists, but also the project itself. So I started to actually dive into things like the UX a lot more heavily and really figure out how flows and systems work, how to do a little bit of game design, how to do character design, UI, all that stuff kind of came together, and it kind of kept going from there. After that point, I worked in more games, and then I realized that UI, while it's really fun and it appealed to the visual designer in me, it wasn't really what I wanted to do long term as well. And I geared much more heavily after that into the UX side of things, and much more specifically dealing with actual problems. Like, I noticed a lot of companies are very superficial in what they do, and my belief was kind of like I wanted to actually help people with stuff, not just make another chat app or another music player or whatever. I really wanted to go in and work for companies that are making a big difference in people's lives, whether that's making their HR a little bit easier, whether it's making a platform for people to find jobs, whether that was a watch app to help you if you have heart rate issues, or if you have emergency response issues, or whether it's gamification of education apps. Stuff like that really appealed to me, so I kind of kept going from there. And yeah, it just kind of kept branching out, and I learned a lot. I listened to a ton of whoever and whatever I could find. I was lucky that some of the companies I worked for had really good people to mentor me, really experienced managers and senior designers, really good resource libraries. ADP was another great example. They have a big resource library of design there from their center of excellence that they have in New Jersey. And yeah, I kind of just kept going from there, and wet my beak with working in startups and learning how to build a company from the ground up, how to do the marketing, how to do the pitch decks, how to get investors' attention on you, how to have powerful messaging, copywriting, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it all kind of came together, and it kind of keeps growing as I move forward in my own career.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you what advice you can give to the new ones that is jumping to the UX right now. There actually I don't have any certificate, for example, but mm-hmm. I have worked in doing the steps, like the entire user experience process. So I believe that we can go for UX as much as we can, iterating or knowing people or connecting with seniors or with whatever,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a great point, and so another really great question too. I would say for people starting off or transitioning who have come from different industries, one of the things that you'll see more and more in the years coming forward, and you've probably already seen it now on different news sources, is that transferable skills are a big thing. I think a lot of times people shortcut themselves and think that I've come from a background where I can only do this and I can only do that. And I won't lie, when I started my career in UI and in games, I had a hard time getting that first job because a lot of people saw my resume and they said, oh, you worked as an animator, like, why would I hire you? But eventually I was persistent enough and I kept applying. You hear that story all the time of people starting off in the industry, and they're like, oh, it's really tough and I have to do multiple jobs and I do this and I do that. I did the exact same thing. When I started off, I wasn't, I still maintained a part-time retail job because I never knew if I had the ability to have an income, right? I didn't know if I was going to be able to, pay my bills. So I always worked on the side. I always had that side hustle to keep myself busy and keep myself hungry. But I always focused on my work. I came home after my shift, no matter what, and I would try to do something, design something, always try to update my portfolio, focusing on specific pieces instead of trying to do the whole thing at once. I tried to do just one project at a time. I try to do things like analyze other existing, platforms or websites and do my take on what I would do differently, why I would do them better. I would do different explorations of things. A lot of the times, some companies I would apply to, they would give you a test for things like UI or UX, and they would say, here, do this thing or do that thing. And then maybe then I never got that job, but that test was a great way for me to keep practicing. And then I would use that as a way for the next job to say, okay, well, I've practiced this stuff, so I can apply it to the next job or to the next portfolio project as well. Networking, I know it's hard now with COVID, obviously, but before that, it was something I would definitely have suggested, go and be present and go and get your name out there. What we have with the Discord channel, I think is great. I see the recap messages, and a lot of you are, asking questions and trying to get guidance, and people are sending links and portfolios, which I think is fantastic. I think that's definitely a great way of doing it. Just locally, like trying to connect with people around you, people, researching who's in your city, what companies are there, what kind of work do they do, and really does your work, fit with that? I think a lot of the time people don't really take time to say, well, I'm a designer, but I've made a lot of designs for e-commerce. Well, you might not fit in with another, discipline. Some companies are looking for specific things like fintech or e-commerce or SaaS experiences. So if you're looking for those kind of roles and those are the companies that are hiring, make sure that your work reflects that too, right? If you're going in with like a generic travel app thing, but they're looking for e-commerce, that might not really work because they might not see that. Sometimes it's luck and persistence, and it sounds cheesy, but it really is that. I've waited 6 months to 8 months sometimes for a job because it just wasn't the right time, or they just said, we're still looking, you're not the right fit, blah, 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 blah. All these, whatever excuses they can come up with, they'll tell you. But you just keep applying, keep going back and say, yeah, I've updated my stuff. Being persistent definitely pays off. Connecting with people within the company, taking the time to connect with them on LinkedIn, connecting with multiple people from that company if you're interested, HR managers, leads, product managers, whoever you can kind of find that you can directly work with, and send them little bits of your work and say, here's who I am, here's what I want to do, I'm really passionate about this, and here's why. I think those things all go a long way as well. I don't have a formal certificate or degree either from an actual UX or UI school. I went for animation design. Yeah, I learned my color theory, I learned my lighting theory, I learned my painting, my anatomy, my structure, my timing, my animation, but those things don't necessarily apply to UX as a whole. However, like I said, transferable skills are a big deal, so don't shortcut yourself and write yourself lower than what you are in things like your resume or your profile. Using strong, actionable words in your profile makes a big deal. Really going in and really announcing those victories that you had, that project that you worked on. A lot of the things I worked on, they are in fact award-winning due to the contributions of the things that I've made in them. So yeah, I do take some credit in that and saying that, yes, I have earned some awards by virtue of the work that I've done with all the projects that I've been on. And yeah, they're team efforts, and definitely people deserve their credits, but at the same time, so do we as designers, right? We are often not celebrated, and our names are not on the cover or the box of something right up front. So you have to be a strong proponent of the things that you've done yourself, because no one else will be. So that's another thing as well. Make sure you have a strong online presence, strong written resume that's well written, it's concise. You don't need it to be too long. Most recruiters will not look at something that's longer than 2 pages. So a page and a half is probably fine. If you can get it down to a page, even better. Strong, actionable words are really important. Maintaining your, social connections and maintaining your thoughts are a great way. Joining in discussions on things and weighing in is also important. I've recently, over the last 2 years myself, really have gone into podcasts as well, and I listen to a lot of them through other people and through what they're saying. So that's another great resource, as well as listening to what other people have to say. I think Google has a great one. I think it's just called Google's Material Design Podcast or something like that. They talk through their designers through all their different products and their what they went through and their hardships and how they work and stuff like that. So yeah, it's really good to do that as well. And then just stay active. Like don't stop doing new projects and new work. always, do little projects. If you're stuck and you're like, I'm not sure what to do, there's those things you can enhance. Look at a pre-existing platform or website and maybe take a vertical slice out of that and say, I'm going to really refine this and I'm going to really deep dive it and think through what could be better, why. There's a lot of these kind of things as well. So
yeah, I'm so happy to hear you. I was really like what this guy has to offer to us. Yeah, it's really appreciate so much. Thank you very much.
no, thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Daniel. That was awesome
Yeah.
presentation.
Awesome. And I think you can be useful for people that wants to who is already in the design challenge. You know what? Yeah. So I think this information architecture could be really useful, and your advice to them. Yeah. So thank you.
Post your
LinkedIn.
post your podcast and I'll promote it on my LinkedIn.
Sure.
Get the word out.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Let me just grab it here for you guys. But thank you so much for having me. I mean, like I said, I really do appreciate it, and think that it's wonderful you guys have had me here. I'm going to add in the podcast there in the corner in the chat. Like I said, I've just started this up, so I'm still pretty new to this. I'm learning as well, but it's something I wanted to do for a long time. But yeah, I'm always happy to share my knowledge. I know that frustration and that feeling of, hey, I'm looking for work, things are hard. I've taught, people at school. I was an instructor for a number of years in art design, UX, UI as well. So I know what it feels like to mentor people coming in brand new from high school and college, but also people who are a little bit more experienced. So I'm glad you guys got something out of this, and I'm always happy to help out wherever I can.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here, and I hope you can put it here also your LinkedIn account.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will do that. Let me just grab the URL here for you guys. And then, yeah, if you want to add me or have any questions, like I said, super happy to take some time to do that. So, yeah.
There you go. Great. I put also mine. If anyone, and also before I put it the Discord channel, please in the chat. In the chat, if you wanted to come to join us there, yeah, you're welcome. So thank you guys for everything. It was amazing. I am going to upload this video, and you can share, Daniel also, and I will put also your postcard in Iterate UX account in LinkedIn and mine and Adam's. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if there's anything that we can do for you, please let us know. Happy to help.
Yep, for sure. Always happy as well. I know it's hard to get a big crowd. It's people from all over the place, different experience levels and different stuff. But I think there's something for everyone. So likewise, I can try and do what I can for everyone here. If you guys have questions and so on. But yeah, I'm always around as well. So feel free to message me either on the Discord, LinkedIn, wherever, and yeah, we'll connect from there.
Okay, thank you. I will see your podcast. I will hear your podcast. Yeah, thank you. I think we finished. Yeah. Everyone has a question? Anyone? No? Okay. So we finished them. So see you next week. Thank you to everybody to be here. See you. Bye-bye.